What's up, Jackalopes? Happy February. I kind of can't believe that it's already February, but at the same time, January felt really long. I don't know how to reconcile those two things, but here we are. Now that it is February, I've had some time to really process the things that I read in January, which admittedly was not very much. I was sick for most of the month, and I'm just kind of now getting over it. That being said, I might still be coughing in this video. I've been trying to kind of cut that out. I did that in my last video, so hopefully the coughing will be better this time around. But I am feeling quite a bit better, and I did manage at the end of the month to kind of catch up on some of the reading that I had missed earlier on, but I still didn't read very much. But I read some, and I did make decent progress on my big reread challenge that I've set myself. That being said, I read 3 books in January. 2 of them are quite small, but I successfully read them, and that's what matters. The first book that I managed to read in January was The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is a kind of fantasy horror thing about a guy who returns to his childhood home, sort of the street that he used to live on, when he is in town for a funeral, and ends up finding his way down to this pond where he used to sit and talk to this neighbor girl named Letty Hempstock. And while he's sitting there, he starts to recall this pretty horrific thing that happened to him when he was a child. Like, it's very creepy. Which is, I mean, admittedly exactly what I was hoping for when I picked this book up, because I had heard that it was very creepy. And it did not disappoint. I gave this book 5 stars. I thought it was very spooky. And I absolutely loved all of the characters, even the characters that you weren't intended to like. Like, I enjoyed them, even though they weren't likable characters. So I felt like all of the characters, despite this being a very short book, were mostly pretty well developed with a handful of exceptions. And I really, in particular, loved the Hempstocks. I thought they were really interesting and also kind of creepy and spooky, but not in like an off-putting way. They were just interesting because I was trying to figure out how to understand them, if that makes sense. They're very strange characters, but really interesting. And I felt like the ending was perfect for this book, so it was just great all around. Highly recommend it if you like spooky things. The second book that I finished in January is for my Redwall reread. I read the first book, Redwall, and this follows the story of Matthias, who is this mouse here on the cover. He takes up the mantle of being the warrior of Redwall when the abbey comes under siege by a rat warlord named Clooney the Scourge. And so it follows Matthias's quest to retrieve the sword of Martin the Warrior so that they can defeat Clooney and save the abbey and save the Woodlanders. That's basically the entire plot, and it held up a lot better than I thought it was going to, because I absolutely loved this book as a kid, but I was worried going back, having thought about it for a while, that it was not going to hold up for me very well, but I actually thought it was still very solid. I gave it 4 stars. I definitely had some issues with it, but I also had a lot of nostalgia for it and enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to. But it's a pretty solid adventure. It's got a lot of good friendships in it, particularly the friendships between Matthias and Methuselah, who is the recorder of the abbey, and Constance, who is Badger, and the abbot, Mortimer. So those are like really great, wholesome friendships that are just very supportive. And there's also a really cute romance. I know that this is aimed at kids, so they can't have the kind of back and forth tension that exists, I think, more in romances that are written aimed at an older audience. The romance in this book is just so wholesome and good, because it's Matthias and a little church mouse named Columbine. And no, not Columbine. Sorry, that's the next one I read. It's a church mouse named Cornflower. So Matthias and Cornflower have this little romance, and it's just absolutely adorable because they just immediately like each other. They get along together, they have fun together, they enjoy each other's company, they kind of tease each other in that fun, obviously like not mean way where they understand that it's not mean. So they just have this adorable little romance, and it's just really wholesome and good, and it just made my heart happy. Matthias also learns like some interesting lessons about, you know, the kinds of things you'd want to teach a little kid, like don't judge someone based on their, like, your presumptions about them, and power of friendship, those kinds of things. So, you know, it's pretty standard fare, I think. What wasn't standard, and what kind of surprised me, is that there is way more, like, horror tropes in this than I thought there were going to be. There was some really creepy scenes that I don't really remember reading as a kid, but they're really upsetting. There's even a scene that very, very closely mirrors something that happens in an early section of the horror video game Resident Evil 7. That was very jarring, seeing that, where I was like, this is a thing that happened in a horror game, and it's here too. So I wasn't really expecting that. But that wasn't like a deal breaker for me. It doesn't bother me. It just completely caught me off guard because I didn't remember there being that much horror in this. But there is. The only, like, real negatives for me for this book was that there were parts of it that I felt were they kind of dragged a little bit. There were also some weird contradictions where, like, the Woodlanders are described as being very peaceful and very kind and compassionate, and then they, in several scenes, acted very much the opposite of that, even when unprovoked. So that was kind of iffy for me. And then there's also a couple of examples, particularly towards the beginning, where he's setting the plot in motion, where there was just some writing that I felt like was a little bit lazy, where stuff was pushed forward by someone being like, oh, my senses tell me that X, or I heard in a dream that Y. And that, it didn't work for me because in the instances where that happened, there was another very obvious way to deal with that, to push the plot forward, but that wasn't taken. I think that just could have been handled a little bit better. It would have made more sense for the characters to give a specific reason because they had a specific reason. But those were, like, the only major issues I had with the book, and I'm really going to go into detail more later. I'm planning to do a quarterly wrap-up as I'm working my way through this project. So if I get through all of them, that's going to be 6 books for the first quarter, and that will be probably end of March, beginning of April. So if you're interested in hearing more of what I have to say on this, and it will probably be pretty spoilery, because I would like to go into some pretty good detail about this, you know, expect that at, like, the end of March, early April. I had another book that I should have read this month for this reread, but I read most of it. I didn't read the whole thing. I will talk about it again in a few minutes. But yeah, I didn't successfully read the 2 that I set out to read. Oh well, I'm still on track, mostly. The last book I did read in January is Saga Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is a this is a comic about a young family who, these two, Alana and Marco, are from opposite sides of a space war, and they are trying to escape so that they can raise their daughter and basically live in peace. This is an extremely fast-paced read. I mean, it's also quite short and mostly pictures, but I read this in one sitting, and part of that was just that I loved the characters so much. I particularly like Marco here, and there's another character called The Will, who I think is really interesting because he's not necessarily a good guy, but he's not bad either, so I'm really interested to see how he develops through the story. I was really regretting that I didn't buy Volume 2 of this when I bought this one, so I have yet to get my hands on a copy of Volume 2, but hopefully soon. Although there's actually a compendium that's the first 50 volumes, I think, and I think I'm going to try and get that, because I'm just already so invested in this that I'm sure I'm going to love the rest. Yeah, it was just great. This was a little break that I needed between finishing Redwall and starting the next book in that series. It was a nice little, like a snack food of a book between those 2 books. Oh, it also has some really interesting ideas about like violence and family that kind of get explored, so that's really fun. If you're interested at all in like sci-fi, fantasy, space operas, anything like that, I really recommend this. Unless you don't like violence and sexual content, because there's like also a ton of that in here. But if that doesn't bother you, I extremely highly recommend this. This was 5 stars for me. I can't remember if I already said that. But getting back to the book that I didn't finish in January for the Redwall reread, I actually just put onto my February TBR, and I have now finished it, but I finished it in February. So I will talk about it more in my February wrap-up. But since I did move it onto my February TBR, I just want to go ahead and talk through that and let you guys know what I'm hoping to read. One thing you'll notice is that I didn't finish all the books on my TBR from last month, and I have a completely different set of books on my TBR for this month. I'm very much a mood reader, so currently my method of making my TBR is just sitting down at the beginning of the month in front of my shelf and just looking at it and deciding what do I currently feel like reading. So I think I might eventually put together some sort of like game or other system for picking my TBRs, but for the moment I'm just using my mood reading system. That being said, I do have my plans to read all 22 Redwall books this year, and the one that I didn't finish in January that I should have was Mossflower, but I finished it on the 2nd of February, so it was really close anyway, and I'm now reading the 3rd book. But this is on my February TBR. This is about Martin the Warrior, who is a legendary figure for Redwall Abbey, and this is about him first arriving in Mossflower and helping to free Mossflower Woods from the rule of this tyrannical wildcat empress who swept in and conquered everything. And so it's just the story of how he became this legendary warrior. And I actually will say that I enjoyed this one more than I enjoyed Redwall on a reread. But that's all I'm going to say about this for now. I'll talk about it in my wrap-up at the end of the month and in my quarterly wrap-up for the reread. So for this month, I have 2 more books to read for that reread. The first of these is Madameo. This is the 3rd book in publication order. This follows the son of Matthias from the first book, Redwall. And basically a fox who is involved in the slave trade shows up at Redwall, and he sneaks in and kidnaps a bunch of the Woodlanders, including Matthias' son. So Matthias has to go on a quest to save his son Madameo, and at the same time Madameo starts to come into his own and prove that he is worthy of carrying his father's sword. The next one that I need to read this month for the Redwall reread is Mariel of Redwall, and this one follows a young mouse who is cast overboard by the king of the sea rats, Gabul the Wild, and she washes ashore not close to Redwall, I don't think, but she ends up at Redwall and is cared for there, and upon recovering, she makes friends with the local woodlanders and embarks upon a quest to, as the back says, reclaim her identity and get revenge on Gabul the Wild. That's all I know about this because it's been so long since I read it. I really don't remember anything about the story beyond that. But I know that this is a really popular one. A lot of people will list Mariel of Redwall as their favorite. And I am interested to see, again, how the whole theme of, like, reclamation of identity comes into play. So I'm excited to get to this one. But first, I'm currently reading Madameo. I just started it. But these are pretty quick reads for me, so if I set the time aside to read them, I think I can do it. The one caveat being that I am also about to study for the GRE pretty heavily, so we'll see. Hopefully I'll have more books to tell you about at the end of February, more than 3. Because those aren't the only 3 books I want to read this month. I have 3 other books that I want to read in February. One of them I actually already have read because it's quite short, and again, I wanted a little break between reading Mossflower and starting Madameo, which is why I'm only at the very beginning of Madameo. But the first book on my kind of other part of my TBR is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which is a pretty classic closed circle whodunit type mystery where 10 people are all tricked into going to this island, and while they're there, they start dying in mysterious ways, and they have to figure out who is murdering them to try and survive. That's the basic premise. I actually already finished this, but I will talk about it again in my wrap-up for February. But it was a nice little break between the two Redwall books that one I just finished and the one I'm starting now. What I find with Redwall is it's kind of a lot of children's fantasy at once if I read them straight through, because I'm noticing even with taking breaks between, I'm getting names mixed up and things like that, which it doesn't help that there's also names that are carried over between books. So the leaders of certain groups of animals are always given the same title. So the leader of the moles is always Formole. The leader of the shrews is always Logalog. The leader of the otters is always Skipper. So when you're reading them kind of back to back, it starts to blend together a little bit. So I am trying to take some small breaks in between reading the Redwall books. So, and Then There Were None was a good book for that. So that was the first thing I put on my TBR beyond Redwall books this month, and I've already read it. The next one that I put on my TBR for the month is, if I can get a hold of it, geez, is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This has been on my TBR. Well, it's been on my list of books that I really want to read for a very long time. I actually have an ebook of this, but I just decided that I would rather read it as a physical version. And so I picked this up last month, and I'm looking forward to reading this because I've never read Dracula, and I really want to read Dracula. But also, there's the new BBC adaptation, so I really want to read this and then watch that and just see how the two compare. Especially because I have seen a previous adaptation by the same writing duo. It's the same two guys that wrote the BBC's adaptation of Sherlock. I also may do something later with this and looking at the adaptation, because I am, like I said, interested in looking at the adaptations of this same author, or same writer duo. And I'm thinking I might at some point put together some sort of comparison video looking at Dracula and its adaptation, and then Sherlock Holmes and its adaptation. But first I gotta read all of the source material, so I'm starting with Dracula. And then the last book on my TBR for the month is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. I am hoping to get to this month, because I think this will be another good book to kind of slot between a couple of Redwall books. It'll be something different. It's still fantasy, but it's a different kind of fantasy. And also, this fulfills one of the goals that I set myself for the year, where I wanted to read more books that came from genres and categories I don't usually read. And I don't really read YA all that much. I just haven't really found much of it that appealed to me. I figured this will kind of slot right in there, make a nice little break for me between the Redwall books, and also it'll fulfill that goal of reading some more things that I wouldn't normally pick up. That's all the books on my TBR for the month. I will see if I get through all of them. Like I said earlier, I am about to schedule the GRE and really buckle down and start studying for it. So my time for the next couple of months might be somewhat limited, but I am hopeful that I can get through these. I think at the very least, if I make the time, I can definitely get through the Redwall books. That's the big goal, because I really want to achieve this massive reread goal that I have set for myself. In part just to prove to myself that I can do it, because it's a lot of book to read, and but I love the books so much that I'm excited to read the rest of them. But yeah, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please feel free to leave a comment. I feel weird saying this, but you can like and subscribe too. I don't know how to include that in anything. I feel weird asking people to do that. But yeah, if you enjoyed it, please do feel free to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of any of these books if you've read them, or if you have other recommendations. And I hope you have a great day.